Hi, so yes, I'm Fazilla. I'm here to talk about looking at how we can write and develop flexible and robust and smart outcomes. So why is it so hard to write smart outcomes? And I know whenever I've asked this question and I say, what's smart? Everybody goes, yes, it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's realistic or relevant to the aspirations, and it's time-bound. Everybody knows that, and yet it's still really hard. And I think it's important to remember that, one, it is actually quite a difficult skill to develop outcomes, and it needs lots of practice. But equally, it is a change in culture and mindset. You think about the old statements, they were very much kind of objective-driven, deficit model, focusing around needs, and really not looking at holistic life outcomes. And now, hopefully, we're turning that on its head. And with the new education, health and care plans, we're looking at that more holistic lifestyle. What do our young people want to achieve? And that's suddenly a different way of thinking, not just for professionals, but for young people and parents alike. The challenge of writing smart outcomes, we've said already, it is actually a difficult skill. And I've known many professionals struggling with this, but they have all said, so keep the faith, that the more they're writing them and developing them, the easier it's becoming. They're starting to get the hang of it. But there are some other reasons also why we struggle, and perhaps we're going down the kind of woolly, vague route for outcomes. And that might be around concerns around we don't want to raise young people's expectations, we don't want to raise parental expectations. It might be that actually we're concerned around provision and the resources that we have to be able to deliver that. And actually we think that, in fact, by having woolly outcomes, being vague, as I think a famous cartoonist wrote, Edgar Allan Poe, if you can't be kind, at least have the decency to be vague. And the idea is that, it's less confrontational. If it's all just very woolly, actually nobody can really pin down on anything, and therefore we're not going to upset anyone. But actually the opposite, in fact, is true. And you need to have smart, robust outcomes to actually help manage expectations. If you can visualise the same picture, that's absolutely really key when you're looking at agreeing outcomes, because what you don't want to have is different views around the table, thinking that, I don't know, we've talked about the example of perhaps having some kind of skill, maybe it's playing music. And the young person wants to be a pianist, and they're looking at playing the piano, and that's their aspiration. Maybe the family is thinking, actually, just doing a few tunes would be great. It's really good therapy. It keeps her calm. That's fantastic. And the school is thinking, actually, again, manual dexterity. It's going to be a problem to cover the keyboard. Her memory, retention of music, that's going to be difficult. So people may be agreeing and thinking about different things in that room until you can agree that final picture and visualise it and be clear about all of that. You might have that young person raising their expectations, thinking they're going to be able to achieve something that in reality, those around the room, if you'd had a robust conversation, wouldn't actually necessarily think was realistic. So you do have to be able to know when you've got to that outcome and when you've achieved it. And more importantly, we talk about the young people and being person-centred, and that young person absolutely has to buy into that outcome, because they are the ones that are going to be delivering it. They need to be the ones that understand what does success look like, what is the benefit, what is the difference I'm going to see to my life if I can achieve this. So what are the key components to a good outcome? Well, we've talked about SMART. But also the important thing to note is they're usually longer term, because again, we're looking at preparing for adulthood, getting paid employment, training, education, etc. So we're looking at more holistic, longer term outcomes, either a few years or perhaps to the next key stage, but certainly longer than a 12-month period. Again, we've talked about linking to aspirations, so you might have the thread of, if somebody wants to be, I don't know, a musician, then the outcomes might be focused more around music and reading, etc., so that it would help that individual achieve that potential aspiration. Talk about obviously very clear and simple, because that young person has to be able to understand it. It has to be articulated in the words that they would use and understand on the basis it's actually come from them. And hopefully if we're being person-centred, that would be the case. We've talked about life, kind of whole life outcomes, so it should really be holistic. We talk about education, health and care plans, and so ideally you would incorporate all of those aspects within that final overarching outcome. And again, framed positively. You know, we knew the statement had a very much of a deficit model. This should be very positive about what they can do, as well as what they cannot do. And therefore, you know, I've heard examples of outcomes being, you know, I will not throw the chairs around the classroom. Well, actually, not such a positive outcome for that young person. But what you could say is, you know, maybe by the time I'm 15 or 16, I'll have learned 3 or 4 strategies to be able to remain calm in the classroom. Okay, so that's a different way of saying it's far more positive. The other important thing to note is it cannot be based around provision, and that's a real confusing point, I think, for a number of individuals when they're developing outcomes. So what is provision? Well, we know it can be equipment, it could be a wheelchair, it could be a resource, a strategy, perhaps an approach, it might be small group working. That's provision. What we can't have is an outcome based on that. So, you know, young people, families might say, well, actually, I'd like to go to an after-school club. Well, actually, that's provision. The club is provision, as is school, as is college. So they could be an aspiration. A young person could absolutely say, yeah, I'd like to go to college. That's a great aspiration, but it cannot be an outcome. And neither so, I don't know, a young person saying, well, I want a powered wheelchair. That's provision. So if you look at the example of, say, for example, a footballer, I want to go to a football club. Well, great. The question we should be asking, what is it that you want to learn in going to that football club? And hopefully the answer will be, I want to play football. I want to learn the skills of playing football. So it's around learning those skills to play football that would be your focus of your outcome, and not the fact that they're going to a football club. The provision could be then the football club itself, football boots, PE lessons, etc. And it does have to be focused around what we can control, what we can do, and what we can see. The other example I use around global warming, you know, I can't control what China and what India are doing in terms of global warming, but if I want to do more recycling, I could say in 2 years' time I will have at least 80% of my rubbish recyclable. So that's something that I can control and influence. Okay? And we have to make sure that all of these outcomes can really demonstrate that they're making a benefit or a difference to that young person. So if we look at our pyramid, and if you'll have heard, hopefully, some people talk about this golden thread working through. So you'll have your long-term aspiration. So again, if you think about our footballer, you might say, I want to be a footballer when I grow up, play for Man United or something, or Liverpool. So then you would look at, well, what would be those overall outcomes? And it would be then around, we talked about the learning the skills to be able to play football. So it could be that by the time I'm 18 or 19, I'll have learnt the skills to be able to play football at a local club level. Then you've got the short-term targets. Well, how are we going to achieve that overarching outcome? And it might be then that actually in the short term that perhaps you would have targets in a school plan that, you know, it's something around being able to dribble or kick a ball, or being able to stand and balance, etc. So it's one of those building blocks that's going to enable that young person to be able to achieve those outcomes that are more longer term. And then when you look at provision, that's when we're looking at, well, actually, maybe they could go to a football club, or we could look at PE lessons and maybe doing a bit more football in those lessons, or strengthening muscles, or whatever it is that would help him play football better. It could even be looking at specialist football shoes or boots that would help him facilitate to be able to kick and be stable when he's doing that. So that's your provision. And then you've got your evidence and measures. So how do we know that we've got there? What information are we going to be using to say that we've achieved this? And whether that's in form of reports from school or from the football club, whether it's just watching a game, whether it's videoing them playing football, whatever it is, you need to be clear about what does that end outcome look like. So here's just quite a simple framework, particularly if you're just starting off trying to work through and develop some outcomes. It's by the time I'm, so that you've got that time-bound aspect from the SMART. So by the time I'm, and you've got an age or a key stage, and do note that obviously this is 0 to 25. So if you've got young children in early year settings, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, Your longer term might actually be only 2 or 3 years. It might be just be going into reception or year 1. If you're, I don't know, a young person who's in primary and maybe in year 6, it could be reasonable to be looking at what would you be doing when you're leaving school. But equally then, if you're already going into adulthood, you might be 16 or 17. Suddenly you've got outcomes that might only be about getting, learning some new skill or profession by going to college. Okay, so depending on the age of the child, you might have very different timings for those outcomes. And equally then, what's the benefit or the difference? Well, I can, or I've learnt. Learning the skills is actually quite an important phrase, I think, because again, it differentiates that provision versus the skill of I want to be able to learn to play football. And what we know is that we're all concerned about guarantees, and the plan isn't about guaranteeing anything necessarily, but what we can demonstrate, whether you're a school or a professional, is that I will have ensured that I can teach them the skills. So for example, I've learnt the skills to be able to socialise and talk to my friends. Yeah, what we're not being able to guarantee is that they will have lots of friends. We don't know that, but we can support them to learn those key skills. The other fact here I'm maintaining. Now again, that's important because you've got all ranges of abilities for our young people. You've got your very high functioning that might be under SEND support, and that's equally important because we know the SEND principles affect those under SEND support in school, not just with an education, health and care plan. But equally, you've got children who are very profoundly disabled. They might have life-limiting conditions, and actually trying to talk about, long-term, 16 years, etc., may well be very unrealistic and quite distressing for those young people and also for their parents. So again, it might be that it's just maintaining over the next year or two, and that could be as good an outcome as somebody trying to get a job at adulthood. And remember again your questions always, what does success look like? How will we know when we've got there? So an example of a SMART outcome, by the time I leave primary school, I've learnt the skills to take turns in classroom activities without support. So here you've got your timing, the primary school, year 6, you've learnt the skills to take turns, and we've got that specificity in terms of the setting. It's in classroom activities. We're not saying it's in the playground or having big major conversations, etc. And you've also got the flexibility of with support, without support. Here we've said without support is independence. But you can clearly see when when that young person will have achieved that outcome. So the other concern people have around outcomes is ensuring that they are flexible, and outcomes must be flexible because life changes, things move on, and as I say, we can't guarantee anything. And I know many teachers are saying, well, we can't have GCSEs as an outcome because we can't guarantee that. And of course we can't do that until somebody opens that envelope in August. When they're looking at the results, they're not going to know. However, I think if everyone around the table agrees that realistically that young person can absolutely achieve at least 4, maybe 5 GCSEs, then we should be putting that down. So here the at least 4 GCSEs suggests that that's realistic, but hopefully the stretch and the ambition is that they will achieve more than that, and maybe 5 or 6. Again, the other example here is riding the bike, and we've added here with some support. So again, it's giving you a level of flexibility in terms of what does that support look like. And just to help you think around flexibility, of course, as we're coming up to annual reviews, rather than kind of throwing the baby out the bathwater, what you should be able to do is look at those outcomes and say, well, where are we now? So in terms of timing, it might be that if that child and young person is overachieving it, maybe they've already got there. Fantastic, great. What you would do is stretch that outcome and add a further level of difficulty to that. If, however, they haven't achieved it, it might be that you're looking at provision and you're looking at the strategies and why they haven't, and you might decide from a timing perspective, actually, we need to move it another year or 2 on, okay, so that it helps that young person get more time to achieve that. We've talked about provision, about looking at and assessing that, and that's very important in the annual review process, to look at, are the strategies working? Are they helping? If not, what could we be doing differently? So that we're all thinking creatively about how we're supporting that young person. And then the other point of flexibility is obviously the level of difficulty. Clearly, whether something is without support, is being done independently, perhaps is being initiated by that young person themselves, is far more difficult than, with lots of support and prompts, etc. So you can get those 3 points of flexibility, whether it's time, provision and strategy, or level of difficulty. So if something's not achievable, should we be agreeing it round the table? Well, hopefully you're all saying no, you don't agree to it. The whole benefit of actually having these needs assessment meetings or transfer review meetings where you have a number of professionals around the table is that you're able to look at, with everybody's point of view and area of expertise, feeding in to say what is achievable and realistic. And it's absolutely key for you to be able to agree that. It's important to have those kind of transparent, open conversations where everybody is able to input and therefore manage people's expectations about what can be achieved and what can't. And if there is a point of discussion or dispute or it's not clear, then just to be aware that it's actually for the local authority then to make that final decision as to what actually goes on that final plan. So joint outcomes, that's another thing where we're talking about having professionals around the table. Again, that's been quite a challenge. As we know, resources are tight and it's not always possible to have every professional that's involved with that young person able to attend those meetings. But what is important is whether it's through advice and reports that within that overarching outcome, they are able to feed in from their perspective some outcomes that help support that overarching outcome. So for example, here we've got a young person who's age 16 with a BMI of 12. He's got poor feeding, gastro problems, reflux, inflammation of the esophagus, etc., etc. So that young person might be saying, well, I just don't want it to hurt when I'm eating, so I just want to be able to enjoy my food. And the parent's thinking, God, I just want him to be able to put on some more weight. So would you think that's an aspiration or an outcome? Great, yeah, no, absolutely. It's an aspiration because it's not specific enough. We don't have the timings, but you can see overall that's what they want to, where they want to get to. We're not sure whether we can. So to make it a smart outcome, you would have something like, by the time I'm 19, it's given them 2 or 3 years, I'm eating comfortably and I've put her on around 2 stone. And again, if in that meeting, the dietitian is saying, oh, the physio or the medical team is saying, actually, that's not realistic. He's only been putting probably 1/2 stone each year, so maybe we'd be looking at 1.5 stone. Then that's what you would agree around the table. So again, only agree what is realistic and achievable. So how does each area or each function kind of feed into that if you were maybe a dietitian or maybe you're a speech and language therapist? So you've got these different areas here. You've got the school, obviously have a part to play. Here I've got I'm eating all my food from my lunchbox at school, and I've bolded in red here at least 3 to 4 times a week. That's where you've got your areas of flexibility. You could start off with saying once or twice a week, and then as you're getting more successful and that young person is able to meet those outcomes, and then you stretch it and move it on to 3 or 4 times a week. You've got your speech and language there, looking at sensory, feeding, swallowing, how they can input, so it's around chewing. You've also got the gastro team, clearly looking at your medical perspective and making sure that, whether it's medications or whether it's surgery or whatever it's needed for them to be able to eat comfortably. The dietitian, of course, has a role in terms of, that healthy eating. And again, I've said a more balanced diet, and I've bolded that in red. I'm not usually that keen on having words like more, but again, if it avoids a woolly, vague outcome, better to have that word in, whether it's most of the time, more. Personally, I would like to see 80%, 60% so that we're clear about what we're aiming for. And then again, let's not forget parents. We've always said that this is all about co-production and that families, young people, the professionals are all working together to support that young person achieve their overall outcomes. And parents clearly have a key role to play in this. So here, the parental perspective would be, yeah, of course, I'm making sure that, my young person, that they're eating a balanced, healthy meal and snacks on a daily basis. So what's going into the lunchbox or whatever they're having at home is supporting that young person's outcomes. Okay. So hopefully that just makes a bit more sense when you're looking at how does each area feed into those overarching outcomes. And some of those potentially could be targets. So they could go, for example, on a school plan if that was something you would be expecting to see within, you know, a few terms, 1 to 2 terms, or by the end of the year. Obviously, if it's an outcome, ideally it would be longer term. So I think just to end on the final slide, you know, again, if anybody is not convinced through this presentation that they're still keen to write woolly, vague outcomes, I would just, you know, say, think about a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Great quote, you know, it's hard to fail, but it's worse never to have tried to succeed. And I think if the main thrust of these SEND reforms are around helping our young people maximise and develop their potential and raise achievement levels, then we shouldn't be scared to try. We need to give it our all, otherwise we'll have failed before we've even started. So thank you for listening.